Hello and welcome back to another episode of Drug Cultures. I'm Sky Hawthorne, this is my show. All opinions expressed here are my own, as is all the music. As always, nothing I say on the podcast should be taken as medical advice. I'm not a physician. I do not and will not recommend that anybody take any drug for any reason. All content produced here is for the purposes of education, entertainment, and occasionally harm reduction. The year is 1880. The location, the village of Draperstown, nestled in the hills of Northern Ireland, County Derry. Or Londonderry, if you ask the Brits. It's a weekday, so children show up at school in the morning as expected. Wives take care of their gardens, husbands prepare the stalls for a day at the market, and everywhere you go, an acrid chemical smell seems to follow you. From the bushes, from the skin of random passers-by, and on the breath of everyone. Men, women, children, all reek of the stuff. Pungent and sweet, yet unlike anything you'd find in nature, and more like what you might expect to find in a hospital. The scent has been compared to chloroform, rubbing alcohol, and overripe pears, and in parts of Northern Ireland in the late 19th century, it was inescapable. This smell came from diethyl ether, usually just called ether, one of the world's oldest synthetic drugs, one of the most important medical advances ever made, and yet also one of the most obscure public health crises in European history, one that has largely been forgotten about, erased from collective memory. But based on available accounts from physicians and newspapers at the time, the drug was ubiquitous, at least in certain key regions. The habit was most prevalent among working-class men who labored in factories or in the fields as sharecroppers, but was hardly exclusive to them. Women hosted parties called ether bees, where they would all get together and drink ether, and children often attended these and participated as well. The habit was so normalized that it wasn't just a party drug. Parents would send their kids to local grocery stores on errands, and the shopkeepers would give these kids small glasses of ether as a treat before sending them home. School teachers reported smelling ether on the breath of children as young as 10 years old. So why was it that ether, a dissociative anesthetic whose effect usually lasts no longer than an hour and whose use can lead to all manner of unpleasant side effects, how was it that it became so incredibly widespread within this region of Northern Ireland, only to largely be forgotten about in the 20th century? This question has been hotly debated, though remarkably little has been written about it in the last 100 years. Nestled between the potato famine and the creation of the Irish Free State, this rapid proliferation of ether is a chapter of Irish history that seems comparatively unimportant to many historians. And yet, from the moment I first heard about it, I knew it would make the perfect episode of Drug Cultures, because the spread of ether is inextricably linked to so many other social factors that are deeply unique to 19th century Ireland, such as the specific forms of religious bigotry, political exploitation, landlord-tenant relations, anti-alcohol temperance campaigns, and a growing movement of Irish nationalism. You're listening to Drug Cultures. We'll be right back. Ether is a relatively simple drug to make, the end product of distillation of ethyl alcohol with sulfuric acid. We know that sulfuric acid has existed since the 7th century, and alcoholic spirits potent enough to produce ether have existed since the 13th century, so it makes sense that ether would follow shortly. The exact inventor is unknown. Some scholars have credited Lully, the 13th century inventor of distilled spirits. Others say the honor belongs to the German scientist Valerius Cordus, who documented its synthesis and described the product as sweet oil of vitriol. Some give the credit to his contemporary Paracelsus, who recognized that ether had a narcotic effect on chickens. Unfortunately, since this was centuries ago, I can't find any record of why Paracelsus was giving ether to his chickens, and I have to wonder whether chickens might be a euphemism for describing the effect it had on himself. Many scientists throughout history, and you'll know this if you're a regular listener of the podcast, have tested various drugs on themselves. But it wasn't until the late 1700s when scientists began to recognize that ether had potential medical applications, including for managing asthma and treating the symptoms of tuberculosis. At the dawn of the 19th century, after Humphrey Davy published his writings on the short-lived yet powerfully psychoactive effects produced by nitrous oxide, that's laughing gas for those of you who aren't familiar, nitrous oxide became a common subject of scientific self-experimentation and a widespread fixture at parties in the next few decades. People would inhale large quantities of the gas and have little freakouts while everyone else at the party watched, waiting their turn. In 1818, right at the peak of popularity for these nitrous parties, Michael Faraday, the scientist famous for inventing the Faraday cage — scientists did a lot of things back then — drew attention to the fact that ether had a similar but slightly longer-lasting effect profile, and thus the ether frolic was born. Ether frolics were similar to nitrous oxide parties and were popular among similar crowds, particularly scientific and medical students who had some understanding of chemistry and the state-of-the-art in medical science, but nonetheless wanted to party. So these ether frolics were decently popular, soon spreading around Europe and even into parts of the United States, particularly the American South. And it was at one of these ether frolics in the early 1840s where a Georgian physician by the name of Crawford Long got the idea for one of the most important medical advancements ever made: the use of ether as a tool in surgical anesthesia. Shortly after this, in 1842, Long tried it out, performing surgery on a cancer patient who was anesthetized with ether, removing a tumor from his neck in a process that was comparatively painless. This was a massive advancement in medical science. Before this point, surgeries were often prohibitively painful, meaning the pain of surgery was so intense for the patient that the procedure might literally be impossible. Thanks to ether, this was no longer the case. Long, however, just as his name suggests, took 7 years to publish his results, and by the time he published, Dr. Thomas Morton of Boston had demonstrated the exact same result in front of witnesses, and for decades would take credit for the invention of surgical anesthesia with ether, while Long fought for recognition. So, obviously, ether is tremendously important in medical history, even though it's no longer regularly used in hospitals on account of its extreme, and I cannot overstate this, extreme flammability. We're talking like can't keep a single candle in the room if there's ether vapors there. But why was it Ireland, of all places, where ether ceased to be a novelty substance or a party drug and somehow jumped containment, becoming a drug of abuse alarming to local officials and medical professionals? This is a question that has been debated throughout history, with different conclusions that can be drawn, so I think we should go through them one at a time and talk about some of the theories. The most common explanation, and one that certainly has some degree of truth to it, is the idea that large swaths of Ireland had given up drinking alcohol thanks to a charismatic, almost messianic Catholic priest by the name of Theobald Matthew, who had dedicated his life's work to becoming the Johnny Appleseed for a group called the Total Abstinence Society. Father Matthew's beliefs on intoxication were not too different from other devout religious leaders throughout history. He saw intoxication, particularly alcohol intoxication, as sinful, degrading to the family and social institutions, and giving Ireland, particularly Irish Catholics, a bad name. In the 1830s, he began administering the pledge to his followers, asking them to give up alcohol consumption altogether and handing out medals to those who did so. In 1839, he had some 9,000 followers who had taken this pledge. By 1842, that number had jumped, amazingly, to 5 million. It is hard to overstate how politically significant this movement was. In 1840, the chief secretary reported that the duties of the military and the police in Ireland are now almost entirely confined to keeping the ground clear for the operation of Father Matthew. His reach expanded beyond even Irish Catholics. He was more than willing to work with Protestant religious leaders to administer the pledge to all who would take it, which alarmed many of his Catholic colleagues who saw his following as a cult of personality. Many of these Catholic religious figures actually took a significantly less hardline stance toward alcohol and accused Matthew of promoting Manichaeism, the belief that objects or substances can be evil in and of themselves, divorced from the manner in which they were used. Another huge rift among temperance advocates was the fact that Father Matthew was eager to distance himself from any sort of Irish nationalism, which at the time was best exemplified by Daniel O'Connell's repeal movement, which sought the repeal of the Acts of Union between Great Britain and Ireland. Many people in Ireland were less than thrilled to be a part of Great Britain, especially Catholics who were still deprived of the vote. Many of these Irish Catholics toiled as sharecroppers, paying most of their wages to absentee landlords, wealthy British Protestants who might never visit Ireland in their life. What little spending money they had, the men would often spend on drinking alcohol, and repeal organizers like O'Connell were extremely disappointed that Father Matthew refused to recommend his followers spend their newfound disposable income on political agitation. As the old saying went, Ireland sober, Ireland free. That was the goal, and Father Matthew had in fact been far too chummy with the Brits for activists like O'Connell, who felt his brand of teetotalism actually enabled British landlords to lower the boot even further and extract more wealth from the Irish peasantry. Father Matthew's temperance campaign ground to a halt in the mid-1840s for reasons that are obvious to anybody who has studied Irish history. The Great Hunger, also called the Potato Famine, is something we probably don't have time to discuss extensively, but is quite likely the most culture-defining tragedy to ever shape Irish history. These sharecroppers, exploited to their breaking point by British landlords, were forced to rely on potatoes for their own sustenance, as it was the most efficient use of what limited land they were allotted for themselves. When the potato blight hit in 1845, and then again in 1846, the outcome was catastrophic, a famine the likes of which is nearly impossible to imagine. At the start of the famine, there were 8 million people living in Ireland. By 1849, 1 million Irish had died and another million had fled. This famine was not just a natural disaster, but a policy failure. A failure by the landlords who had forced tenant farmers into the position where they had to rely exclusively on potatoes, and a failure by the British government to adequately respond to the famine. Father Matthew's response was also less than stellar. He continued to pound the temperance drumbeat, raging against the creation of pubs next to government aid distribution centers. Of this he wrote, "It often happens that the entire body of laborers, after receiving payment, instead of buying provisions for their famishing families, consume the greater part in the purchase of intoxication drink." It's certainly not new to blame drugs or alcohol for massive public health crises like famine. We saw it recently, actually, with people who blame the drug khat for Yemen's hunger crisis, which you probably know if you listened to episode 1 of this podcast, and if you haven't, what are you doing? Go listen to it. But it certainly was a disappointment for many more politically radical elements of Father Matthew's temperance movement. And Father Matthew did become less relevant during and after the famine years. But many regular people who took his pledge continued to remain loyal to it. And that's where ether comes in, because if there's one thing that's true about human beings, it's that they will always look for a way to obey the letter of the law and not the spirit. The way the story goes, the small village of Draperstown in Derry County was the origin of this habit. And in this town there lived a Dr. Kelly, a reformed alcoholic whose poison of choice had long been whiskey, but who had taken Father Matthew's pledge and had given up drink and was now desperately searching for a new means of intoxication. And thus enter ether. Like many before him, Dr. Kelly realized that inhalation of vapors of ether had an intoxicating effect. This was the means of consumption that had flourished in the decades prior at ether frolics. But he also realized that he can get an even stronger effect by drinking the liquid. Ether, he argued, was a means of intoxication that didn't violate Father Matthew's temperance pledge, and much as Matthew had been the Johnny Appleseed of sobriety, this Dr. Kelly is purported to have done the same for ether drinking starting in 1845. As the Great Hunger worsened, Dr. Kelly is said to have dispensed countless doses of ether to his patients, many of whom were desperate for any kind of relief without violating the pledge they saw as a binding covenant with God. The standard dose for a beginner was 1 dram, which is a tiny amount, around a teaspoon. But as the ether habit spread from Draperstown through the hills to nearby towns such as Magherafelt, Coleraine, and Newton Stewart, many ether drinkers became habituated, sometimes drinking as much as half a wine glass, which is a monstrous amount for someone without a tolerance. Because ether's effect is so comparatively short-lived, ether enthusiasts would sometimes drink it 3, 4, 5 times in a single day. The effects would hit rapidly, the drinker would become giddy, gregarious, social, enraptured with their world around them. It's sometimes described as like a psychedelic version of an alcohol buzz. And as a dissociative anesthetic, it bears some similarities to substances that are more widely used today, such as ketamine or nitrous oxide. But after an hour or so, the effects would wear off, leaving the drinker feeling fatigued and often depressed, especially if they take in a larger dose. This is the story of ether's origin as it is most often told. In some tellings, it's not Dr. Kelly who got everyone in Draperstown hooked on ether, but rather a foreign doctor from Glasgow who had discovered that it alleviated the symptoms of cholera, which was ravaging Scotland at the same time that the potato famine was ravaging Ireland. But the story remains the same. Father Matthew got millions of Irish people, Catholic and Protestant, to quit drinking, and in the words of Ernest Hart, the editor of the British Medical Journal, ether provided a liquor on which a man might get drunk with a clear conscience. It's a compelling story, and it seems to dovetail with what we know about human psychology. As the chemist H.N. Draper put it in 1870, it is impossible not to be struck with the fact that if men are deprived or deprive themselves of any one form of nervous stimulant, they will sooner or later replace it by another. While there's almost certainly an element of truth in this explanation, millions of people did, after all, take the pledge, in my opinion, it misses a key element of the story, which is class. While the Northern Irish ether habit is said to have begun in the 1840s, you don't really see any detailed reports on it until around 1870. It certainly existed in the country in the 1840s, but you don't start to see the accounts of whole towns smelling like ether, or 10-year-old kids showing up to school with ether on their breath, for several decades to follow. The peak of Father Matthew's popularity, mind you, was before the famine, so something else must have acted as a trigger to get people to pick up an ether habit in the numbers that they ended up doing. And that trigger was an 1855 law that amended the tax structure for alcoholic spirits. Until that point, the sale of all alcoholic spirits was subjected to an excise tax. This is part of why Irish whiskey became a thing. People preferred to distill their own spirits illegally so they didn't have to pay this excise tax. The 1855 law amended this tax and made it so that alcoholic spirits could be sold duty-free, provided that they contained a certain concentration of wood naphtha. These spirits, referred to as methylated spirits, were essentially undrinkable on account of their flavor, but still had useful industrial applications, hence the passage of the law in the first place. But what Her Majesty Queen Victoria didn't realize is that ether distilled from these duty-free methylated spirits was functionally identical to ether made from normal alcoholic spirits. The passage of this law meant that suddenly, ether was just much cheaper than it had been before, and alcohol more expensive. Because in the past, people had sold alcohol for drinking that was ostensibly earmarked for industrial purposes. But that wasn't happening anymore. So alcohol got pricier, ether got cheaper. And also remember, Ireland's economy had not fully recovered from the famine. This took decades. So when this law was passed, Ireland was quite poor. And suddenly, you have this cheap intoxicant, abruptly much cheaper than before, and a class of people who never had much spending money to begin with, but after 1 million deaths and 1 million people left the country, the economic situation was even worse for the people who remained. As many economically distressed and beaten down people had done before, and as many would do after, the Irish in this region turned to their drug of choice because it was cheap, felt good, and helped them escape their problems, of which there were many. If there's anything I hope I've beaten into your head on this show by now, it's that drug use is inseparable from the cultural context in which it is used. In the case of both alcohol and ether in Ireland, especially at this time, but really throughout Irish history, that cultural context includes both class and religious conflict. Much of what was written about the Irish ether craze was published by English doctors in British journals, and the blame was usually laid at the feet of Irish Catholics, sometimes subtly, sometimes directly, often with the implication of a moral failing connected to their religion. Dr. Ernest Hart, the editor of the British Medical Journal, who we discussed earlier, stated, "It is a curious fact, if it be true as alleged, that ether drinking flourishes chiefly among Roman Catholics, the Protestant communities being comparatively free from that particular vice." He quotes a doctor from the town of Coleraine saying, "I think it very questionable if, with the exception of an isolated case, Protestants are at all addicted to the habit." We now know that this is false. The so-called ether-drinking region of Northern Ireland contains some predominantly Protestant towns where the habit flourished as well, but at the time it was a very common thing to say. To some extent, it is possible that Catholics were uniquely predisposed to ether addiction on account of their social status. Most landowners were Protestant, most peasant laborers were Catholic, and as such, these Catholic peasant laborers might be more likely to try a cheap alcohol substitute and share it with their immediate circle of family and friends. But you have to look at all these sources through the lens of possible anti-Catholic bigotry, which was rampant at the time. Because Catholics weren't just getting shit for drinking ether, they were also taking flack just for plain drunkenness. That's part of why Father Matthew was so eager to get people to take his pledge, and also why many of his allies in the Catholic Church turned into enemies when he wouldn't advocate for Catholic emancipation or the repeal of the Acts of Union. And in my opinion, that's part of why people blame Father Matthew for the ether epidemic. The insinuation that Catholics were uniquely predisposed to drug-seeking behavior to the point that they needed to find a way to get drunk despite having taken their pledge, while the Protestants were somehow more pure of heart and pure of soul and didn't have that same drive to intoxication. By the 1890s, countless people were writing into local newspapers in the ether-drinking region, complaining about the habit and insisting that something must be done about it. And herein lies the weirdest part of the story, because something was done about it, and that something worked. In 1890, the British government classified ether as a poison, which made it significantly more difficult to acquire for non-industrial or non-medical purposes. This classification, part of a much larger package called the Intoxicating Liquors Bill, did receive some pushback, including from Irish nationalists. Charles Stewart Parnell, leader of the Irish Home Rule Party, described it as a patronizing attempt on the part of the majority of English members in the House of Commons to make the Irish people sober. But as funny and almost prescient to the 1960s as it is to contemplate non-sobriety as an act of political resistance, the bill was quite effective at what it set out to do, which included making it significantly harder to get high on ether. As a habit, ether in Ireland disappeared about as quickly as it arrived. As late as maybe the 1930s, you see some scattered newspaper headlines about shopkeepers getting arrested for selling ether in Derry or Tyrone County, but for the most part, it kind of just went away. So how did this happen? How was it that this habit, which had gripped the region for decades, could be so easily neutralized? Well, for many people, ether was mostly a drug of convenience. Alcohol was the drug that has centuries of culturally ingrained history. Ether was a novel intoxicant that for many people, for one reason or another, was just an alcohol substitute. For some, it was a way to get around the temperance pledge they had taken. For others, it was just a cheaper way to get high, especially after the British government made methylated spirits duty-free. Sure, some people probably loved the effects of ether, but I have yet to encounter the testimony of anyone who felt this way. I've encountered many writings from people who bitterly defend their right to proudly drink alcohol. I think it's probably fair to say that many alcoholics loved the effect of alcohol, while most ether addicts probably just loved being intoxicated on something. At the time, though, I'm not sure that most people saw this distinction. In fact, some people were so excited by how successful ether's classification as a poison was, precisely because they wanted the same thing to happen with alcohol. In the 1890s, a temperance hospital in London, I had to look up what that is, by the way. It's literally a hospital where they don't prescribe you alcohol, which feels so strange because I didn't know they used to prescribe you alcohol. Anyway, a temperance hospital in London came under fire for using ether, for prescribing it medically, despite not using or prescribing alcohol. Anyways, doctors from the temperance hospital fired back in a letter published by The Lancet, saying, "You are probably aware that the special legislation which has put an end to ether drinking in Ireland is an order scheduling ether as a poison, only to be procured as other poisons are. We shall be quite content when alcohol, which has done infinitely more harm than ether, is treated in the same way." Other writers, doctors, and public officials offered similar sentiments. One book from the time, The Modern Treatment of Alcoholism and Drug Narcotism, makes a similar case, saying, "The course was so readily adopted for Ireland by the British government in January last that I have yet hope the day will come when a more deadly allied poison, alcohol, will be placed in the same category, and as dangerous a drug will be relegated to the shelf of the apothecary, its sale hedged in with as stringent precautions as is now the sale of arsenic or prussic acid. For temperance advocates and prohibitionists, ether's classification as a poison represented a beacon of hope for the future of what they saw as the greater evil, enemy number one, alcohol." But alcohol was never banned, in the United Kingdom at least, nor in the Republic of Ireland, which finally declared its independence from Great Britain in 1949. And while Prohibition did have some limited success in other Western countries, most notably the United States, the social and political forces that shaped American Prohibition were quite different than those in the UK. In America, Prohibition would not have been possible without first-wave feminism, the women's suffrage movement, and anti-liquor laws passed during World War I to conserve grain supply. While I'm sure I could do a deeper dive into why it failed across the pond, I'd venture a guess that alcohol was simply too popular. One of the key things you see when you dig into the history of ether is that it never became a universal habit pretty much anywhere, and certainly not in Ireland. While there are tales of entire towns in Derry and Tyrone County falling prey to the habit, most of Ireland, even most of Northern Ireland, remained completely unaffected, to the point that some doctors in the late 19th century had never even heard of recreational ether use. In some of the other countries it spread to in Europe, particularly Poland, there's similar tales of entire towns getting hooked, but clearly the habit didn't dig its teeth in the way alcohol or other drugs like cocaine or heroin have done wherever they've traveled around the world. This seems to indicate that despite the sensationalist reporting on the subject at the time, ether may not actually be that addictive. It's also a drug with side effects that aren't always benign. While the drug itself isn't physically destructive to vital organs in the way that alcohol abuse usually is, daily ether use for many people turned their skin a sickly yellow color, induced tremors and spasms, triggered severe gastric distress and flatulence — ether turns to gas at body temperatures — and in some cases provided the trigger for a severe mental illness. Whether the mental illness would have arisen absent the ether remains to be studied. It's also, and I know I said this earlier, but I really can't stress it enough, highly flammable. There have been several reports of people who got severe burns from drinking ether and then trying to light a pipe too close to their face. By the middle of the 20th century, ether had mostly receded from public consciousness, remembered only for its terrifying reputation by drug enthusiasts like gonzo journalist Hunter S. Thompson, who, in his novel Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, famously wrote the following passage. We had 2 bags of grass, 75 pellets of mescaline, 5 sheets of high-powered blotter acid, a salt shaker half full of cocaine, and a whole galaxy of multicolored uppers, downers, screamers, laughers, and also a quart of tequila, a quart of rum, a case of Budweiser, a pint of raw ether, and 2 dozen amyls. All this had been rounded up the night before in a frenzy of high-speed driving all over Los Angeles County. From Topanga to Watts, we picked up everything we could get our hands on. Not that we needed all that for the trip, but once you get locked into a serious drug collection, the tendency is to push it as far as you can. The only thing that really worried me was the ether. There is nothing in the world more helpless and irresponsible and depraved than a man in the depths of an ether binge. And I knew we'd get into that rotten stuff pretty soon, probably at the next gas station. It's tempting, and probably accurate, to assume that ether had its cultural moment and will never return to popularity now that other drugs have proliferated. But I would have said this about other drugs, like nitrous oxide, which had its first peak in popularity in the early 1800s, then again in the parking lots of Grateful Dead shows, and now has returned with a vengeance in the form of galaxy gas, a terrifying product that I hope to do a deep dive into at some point. But if nitrous oxide can survive all this time, then who's to say that its stinky, flatulent uncle won't make a comeback as well? I'm Sky Hawthorne. This is Drug Cultures. Stay safe, everyone.